China has shown its very responsible attitude in the face of climate change. We are very willing to share our experience on coping with climate change with all countries, especially developing countries.
That was China's Special Representative for Climate Change, Xi Zhenhua, speaking at last month's climate conference in Morocco. Welcome back. We're talking about China's leading role in combating global climate change. Let's go to Arunabha in New Delhi. And Arunabha, the United States says that its investment in new energy technologies will decrease. And I've got two parts to this question. One is what to do for climate change efforts? And two, does it actually give China the opportunity to take the lead in developing new technologies?
China has already been trying to grab that opportunity. In its 12th five-year plan, it had identified 7 new strategic emerging industries, 3 of which were around electric vehicles, clean energy production, alternative technologies, and the others also had some role or the other to play with a clean tech transition. Its 13th five-year plan embeds those ideas even further. So China does not see it only from the perspective of let's save the planet or let's hug a tree. It sees an economic opportunity in these new technologies. Now, compared to that, what happens going forward if the United States decreases investment in clean energy? One, it does cede market share to a growing Chinese juggernaut in this area. Number two, it actually denies or turns a blind eye to a global value chain or a global supply chain on clean energy and other clean technologies, where all of the major countries could have a stake in the pie. Number three, even more importantly, I think, looking a little more into the future, is the role of energy R&D. Mission innovation was announced by the United States along with 20 other countries on the first day of the Paris Conference of the Parties. On the same day, India and France came forward and announced the International Solar Alliance. All of these new platforms had a component of investment, collaborative investment in energy R&D. Now, if you reduce that on one side of the equation, it requires the others to step up, but it also means you're not taking part in those new opportunities that are going to get created. So whether it's jobs, whether it's new technologies, whether it's new sources of finance, whether it is the global supply chain, the United States risks losing out a lot by denying climate science, but also denying all of these other trends. And China is already trying to grab this opportunity, and India is trying to get onto that bandwagon as well. 175,000 megawatts of clean energy by 2022 is India's target. That's transformational. So which part of the story does the United States want to be part of?
Barbara, Andrew told us at the beginning of the program that Donald Trump says that he's prepared to look very carefully at the Paris Accord and keep an open mind on this. Do you think he can be persuaded? And to what extent will domestic opposition to his policies really govern what happens in the future?
It remains to be seen whether he can be persuaded. He did say he has an open mind. I know he listens to his daughter Ivanka Trump, I think, who arranged for him to meet with Al Gore, and they said they had an open conversation about this. I think the evidence is overwhelming that it is in the United States' best interest to continue to meet its commitments, to continue to be a part of the Paris Accord. However, as you know, and as we've discussed, the people that he is nominating to his cabinet have been on record as denying that climate change even exists. So it's going to be an uphill battle. One of the things that may happen in the United States is that Trump administration tries to reduce incentives for renewable energy, subsidies for renewable energy, even though the cost of wind and solar is coming down quite dramatically. But I think that's going to be a hard sell because many of the voters for Trump in the wind and solar-rich industry states around the country benefit from these technologies, including one of the leading states on renewables. Trump has nominated as his new U.S. ambassador to China. So between that and, as you said, domestic opposition, groups like mine, NRDC, are going to fight at every step of the way to prevent and avoid these rollbacks of the protections that have been put in place to protect air and water and our climate, and that will continue.
Andrew, another part of the Chinese effort is to, as they put it, expand their circle of friends in developing countries to climb onto the climate change bandwagon. Yep. Is China going to be able to do this? Is this a challenge for China?
Well, I think that China will be able to do it if they step into the leadership gap that was created by the United States. If the United States does indeed pull out of the Paris Agreement, even worse if they decide to pull out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, which is something that some members of the transition team have also opined about before taking their current jobs. At the same time, there is another side to this that I think needs to be very clear, which is that up until quite recently, the U.S. and China were in a deep disagreement about not only the question of who was going to sort of win the race on clean energy, but really what should be the appropriate role for the U.S. and China in financing coal plants around the world. And so, the fact of the matter is that China has an enormous investment, in fact, one of the biggest investors around the world in coal plants in other countries. Not doing that in China domestically anymore, but they have a huge industry that's been created around this. So there are sort of many sort of studies have been done on this. There's one that was just recently released that suggests that the coal plants built by China since 2001, if you add them all up together, that's the 8th largest emitter in the world. That's a bigger emitter than the United Kingdom, for example. And the United States was one of the countries putting enormous pressure on China to back away from that model. Now, if the Trump administration is going to back away from anything, I think we can probably make a sure bet that that's one of the things they'll stop doing, is pressuring China not to be building coal around the world. And I am quite worried about whether or not we're going to be seeing a consistent effort from the Chinese abroad, or is it going to be a two-pronged? We're going to help with some coal in some places. We're also going to help with renewable energy in other places. And I'm not really sure that in totality, the world can afford that kind of effort from one of the world's biggest developers around the world.
What do you make of that, Tianji? Because China is investing in other countries around the world in coal energy, but it announced, I think in September or October, that it will stop construction of dozens of coal plants inside China.
So I think there is a debate within China and within the Chinese environmental and developmental community about China's approach to coal overseas. I think there are a quite active discussion about what China's approach should be. There is a proposal that actually China should look at the carbon intensity of its portfolio overseas, energy portfolio overseas, and actually try to set up some kind of standards so that the overall carbon footprint of its overseas energy investment can be lowered, and also adding more renewable into that portfolio. So I think there is a debate going on and a discussion going on, because I think the pressure from the international community is also quite strong on China in that aspect.
I don't know, but what do you make of the future use of coal in developing countries? This is a cheaper way to go forward rather than developing clean energy technologies. Are these countries in the developing world going to be able to make that transition from coal to other forms of energy sources?
I think it will vary from country to country. For developing countries, whether it's in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, primary driver of policy in this space is going to be energy access. Now, if we can deliver that through cleaner energy sources at costs of finance that are acceptable, these countries will do it, which is where I think the global collaborative effort becomes important. Even in 2030, despite China's quite aggressive targets, India will be consuming 1/3 of the coal that China will be consuming in 2030, which means that if it has to take on the mantle of climate leadership, it has to step up and do even more than what it has promised. More importantly, in the clean energy transition, it's important that China and all other major investors in the space do not adopt a mercantilist position, which means that if you just simply try to grab market share from one or the other, then we end up creating an atmosphere of trade disputes, investment disputes that does not benefit anyone. As I said earlier, there is a global clean energy supply chain in the making, and we've got to invest our efforts in making sure that all of the countries, whether they're large emerging economies, they're developed economies, or the poorest of the poor economies, have some sort of a stake in this new climate economy. Without that, I think, and as Andrew was saying earlier, we might get to what we've promised so far, but we might not raise the ambition over and above where we are at. And that's what worries me. And whoever takes on the mantle of climate leadership, were the United States to step away from the game, would have to be cognizant of these overarching challenges.
Barbara, what should we make of the fact that Donald Trump met with the former Vice President Al Gore, whom we know is a champion of climate change? I mean, much was made of it in the media here in the United States, but are we perhaps reading too much into that?
Well, I think it's a good sign. He says he has an open mind, but like I said before, the people that he is naming to his cabinet apparently do not have an open mind. So it's really the issue here is what is the United States going to do about coal and renewables, and really what is China going to do about coal and renewables? And we were very pleased to see that the new 5-year plan for environmental protection in China includes a national cap on coal consumption of 4.2 billion tons by 2020. But we think that is not ambitious enough. We think there's a group of Chinese experts, 20 Chinese research institutes, industry experts, academics in the China Coal Cap Consumption Project. And their research has indicated that a coal cap of 3.5 billion tons for 2020 is achievable. In fact, China, its coal consumption in 2013 was 3.96 billion tons, and it has reduced its national coal consumption every year since then, including this year. So this coal consumption cap project believes that 3.5 billion tons of coal consumption in 2020 is achievable through a series of measures that would reduce China's CO2 emissions by over 800 million tons. It would also reduce the choking PM 2.5 pollution in China by 1 million tons and prevent 71,000 premature deaths from air pollution every year. So China, while it's doing tremendous things in decarbonization, it can raise its ambition pretty easily, and we think that would have tremendous implications for global climate and also for its own air pollution problem.
Tianji, on a political level, where does China go to from here? Will it continue bilateral negotiations with the United States and, of course, within the framework of the UN as well?
I think it's hard to tell, but it's worth noting that in the past 8 years, the U.S.-China climate bond, diplomatic bond, is pretty uniquely strong, and I think that's sort of instrumental to the final reach of the Paris Accord last year. So I think it would be a great loss if the U.S. and China doesn't continue on that path with this very constructive cooperation on the issue of climate change. But I think, as we have indicated before, China's climate commitment is very much rooted within its domestic context, and it's also embedded in domestic plans. So at least on the China side, I think the path towards a low-carbon economy is still going on, and a lot of the policy objectives are going to be met.